In this video, we will talk about how to solve radical equations with two radicals. So let's check out this example. Let's say we have the square root of 9x minus 2 minus the square root of x plus 2 is equal to 2. Now, when we're solving these types of equations where we have two radicals or two square roots, we always want to get one radical by itself. So we can start by adding this radical to the right-hand side. So let's do that. So we get the square root of 9x minus 2 is equal to the square root of x plus 2 plus 2. Now we want to get rid of the radical. So what we can do is we can square both sides. So we'll square this side and we'll square this side. So on the left-hand side, when we square this, we're just left with 9x minus 2. So that's good. We got rid of one radical. Now on the right-hand side, we have some number plus another number squared. So when we have something like this where we have two quantities, a plus b squared, where we can call this term a and this term b, the end result is a squared plus 2 times ab plus b squared. So when we do that, we get this quantity squared, so the square root just goes away and we're left with x plus 2. But then we have this quantity times 2 right here. So we get 2 times 2 is 4, so we get plus 4 times the square root of x plus 2. And then we have this last term squared, so 2 squared is 4. Okay, so now let's combine some like terms. So these two terms make a positive 6, and then here we have an x. So let's start by moving both of these terms to the left-hand side. So if we subtract an x, and if we subtract a negative 6, we're left with 9x minus x is 8x, negative 2 minus 6 is minus 8. And on this right-hand side, notice we're just left with this quantity right here, 4 times the square root of x plus 2. All right, so I'm going to erase a little bit and make a little room. Okay, so here's where we were at. Now notice we still have one radical right here, so we want to get rid of that radical. So what we can do is we can square this right-hand side, and we can also square the left-hand side. Now on this left-hand side, when we have some value minus another value squared, so when you have a minus b squared, this turns out to be a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. So if we call this term a and this term b, we get 8x squared, so that's 64x squared, minus, we multiply these two together, so 8 times 8 is 64, times 2 is 128, so we get minus 128x. And then lastly, we have negative 8 squared, which is plus 64. And on this right-hand side, we have this quantity squared. So we first have to square this quantity outside of the square root. So 4 squared, that's 16. And then when we square this square root right here, the square root just goes away and we're left with x plus 2. So we can simplify this right-hand side a little bit by distributing this 16. So we get 16 times x plus 16 times 2 is 32. And now we can move both of these terms over to the left-hand side. So we can subtract the 16x. So let's see what we get. 64x squared minus, if we subtract the 16x, we're left with a total of minus 144x. And if we subtract a 32, 64 minus 32 is 32. So we have this whole left-hand side is equal to, on the right-hand side, we're just left with 0. So now that we're here, we can start by factoring out a 16. So if we pull out a 16, we're left with 4x squared minus 144 divided by 16 is 9, so that's 9x. And then 32 divided by 16 is 2. So we have plus 2 is equal to 0. All right, so remember, we're trying to solve for x. So we can ask ourselves what numbers multiply to 4 times 2, so 4 times 2 is 8, but add to negative 9. Well, that would be negative 8 and negative 1. So what we can do is we can write this inner parentheses as 4x squared minus 8x, and then times a negative 1x, or just negative x. So we're just breaking down this 9 into a negative 8 and a negative 1. And then we have a plus 2 is all equal to 0. All right, from here we'll notice that we can rewrite this as, we can pull out a 4x from each of these terms. So we get 4x, we would be left with just x minus 2. And if we pull out a negative 1 from this group right here, we have minus 1, we're also left with an x minus 2. And that's all equal to 0. So the last step, we'll notice that these two terms are equal, so we can actually rewrite this as, we have the 16 out front, 4x minus 1, so these two terms out here, multiplied by x minus 2, and that's equal to 0. So this is our final factored form. We just have to ask ourselves what values of x would make this left-hand side equal to 0. So to do that, we can set each of these parentheses equal to 0 and solve for x. So I'll write that right here. If we have 4x minus 1 is equal to 0, if we add a 1 to each side, we get 4x is equal to 1, and to get x by itself, we can divide both sides by 4. So we get x is equal to 1/4. And if we set this one equal to 0, I'll write that right here, running out of room, but that's okay. X minus 2 is equal to 0. If we add a 2 to each side, we find that x is equal to 2. So here are our two solutions for x. But one last step is we need to check if each of these solutions actually produce a true result in the original equation. So I'll rewrite the original equation right here. All right, so here are the two solutions that we got for x. We need to plug these solutions into this original equation to verify that they actually produce a correct answer. So if we plug in a 1/4, let's start with that. So we get the square root of 9 times 1/4, so 9/4, minus, if we want, we can write 2 as 8/4, since that's the same as 2. And then we have minus the square root of 1/4 plus, again, we can write 2 as 8/4. Just so we have fractions with the same denominators to work with, is equal to 2. So in this first radical, we get 9/4 minus 8/4, that's the square root of 1/4. And then the second radical, we get 1/4 plus 8/4, that's 9/4, is equal to 2. Now, when we're taking the square root of a fraction, we can take the square root of the numerator and the denominator individually. So the square root of 1 is just 1, and the square root of 4 is 2. So this is just 1/2, minus, right here we have the square root of 9, which is 3, and the square root of 4, which is 2. So we have 3/2 is equal to 2. So 1/2 minus 3/2, that's negative 2/2, which is the same as negative 1. So we're saying negative 1 is equal to 2. That is not correct. So that means 1/4 is not a solution. So lastly, we just need to check, is x equal to a solution? So let's plug that into this equation. So we get 9 times 2 minus 2 minus 2 plus 2 is equal to 2. 9 times 2 is 18 minus 2 is the square root of 16 minus 2 plus 2 is 4 is equal to 2. So the square root of 16 is 4 minus the square root of 4 is 2 is equal to 2. And 4 minus 2 is equal to 2. So that checks out. So the only solution that we end up with is x is equal to 2. So that's our final answer for this one.